Sunlit uplands of Brexit were promised. The sailing's been a little stormier than hoped. Today, new law proposed to make the post-Brexit flow of goods to Northern Ireland smoother. Law proposed with little fanfare.
Northern Ireland Protocol Bill.
And with that, a law in motion which will tear up an international treaty signed less than 3 years ago by the Prime Minister.
It's not a big deal. We can fix it in such a way as to remove those bureaucratic barriers, but without putting up barriers on trade moving north-south in the island of Ireland as well. That's what we want to do.
The protocol drew an invisible line in the sea for goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Today's proposed legislation plans to amend the trickiest bits. There would be no checks for goods entering and staying in Northern Ireland. Businesses here could pick between EU and UK regulations. VAT rates will be set UK-wide by the government, and the biggie, any disputes will be settled by a third party, not the European Courts of Justice.
Unilateral action is damaging to mutual trust. The Commission will now assess the UK draft legislation. In particular, the protocol provides business operators in Northern Ireland with access to the EU single market for goods. The UK government's approach puts this access and related opportunities at risk.
Businesses here in Northern Ireland will be able to pick EU or UK regulations under the new legislation. A major benefit, says the government. Not quite so, says business.
It really does increase the level of uncertainty. And as you know, the thing that business does not like is uncertainty. You need to remember that one of the reasons why the protocol is working for the dairy sector is that dairy companies have invested hundreds of millions of pounds to adapt to the protocol so that it works. Now, what we're seeing here is a level of uncertainty that says, well, maybe the goalposts are going to change here.
This isn't just an issue of trade, it's an issue of governance, or lack of it. Northern Ireland's Assembly shut more than 100 days ago. Power sharing collapsed by the DUP and their opposition to the protocol. No commitment today to re-enter talks.
Publishing the bill doesn't deliver anything in and of itself, but it is nevertheless an important step, and we recognise that. And what we want to see now is the bill progressing in Parliament, and as the bill progresses, of course, we will consider then what that means for devolution in Northern Ireland.
The government's argument is the protocol isn't working. It's so bad it needs to be rewritten. Well, some critics say if it is that bad, there already exists Article 16 within the protocol for taking unilateral, quote, safeguard measures, and that can be done right now. This new law could take months to get through Parliament, even longer if it's held up by the House of Lords.
How likely is it that you think this legislation could pass through the House of Lords?
As currently drafted, it won't.
Could you vote for this bill?
Not as presently advised, no. If there are changes to it, well, then I might change my mind. But there will be a number of members of the House of Lords who will just find it impossible to vote for a piece of legislation which requires the government to break its word.
If you were a betting man, how much would you put on this actually getting through to becoming law?
Well, I think there's probably shorter odds on Boris Johnson not being Prime Minister before this legislation gets through.
Well, do you think that's part of the thinking that's going through people in Brussels' minds, maybe the government in the Republic of Ireland?
Well, why would anybody in Brussels or Washington negotiate with Boris Johnson, give him any kind of, Boris Johnson's holding a gun to their head. Why would they give him anything in terms of flexibilities? Because they don't think he'd be there very much longer.
Tonight, the government set out their legal position. This is a genuinely exceptional situation, they say, providing a, quote, clear basis in international law to justify the non-performance of international obligations. Across the water in mainland Europe, it's an argument unlikely to fly. Look, Downing Street knew this was going to be really tricky. Lots of diplomatic calls over the last few weeks to Dublin, to Brussels and to Washington, because the US government is a guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement. The last few moments we've heard from the US government, they say they remain committed to protecting the Good Friday Agreement, that's a priority, and they urge the UK and EU to return to talks to resolve differences over the protocol. That looks tricky tonight. The rhetoric from the EU has dialed up a couple of notches. Talk of infringement actions, legal action basically. Last year they launched legal action because the UK had extended some grace periods unilaterally. That was paused while these talks continued. Well, as of tonight, that legal action is back on the table. One last point. One of the major reasons given for this law was to get the Northern Ireland Assembly back up and running. Well, you heard from our report there, the DUP leader saying, this is great, let's see when it's actually in law. You also saw this law could take months and months and months. Northern Ireland needs to get an assembly up in 6 months of the election last month. Right now, that election in a few months' time is still looming.
Paul McNamara. Well, I've been speaking to the Irish Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, and I asked him why he's calling this the new low point for the UK and Ireland.
Well, because this is a breach of Britain's word to Ireland. It's also a breach of an international agreement that Britain designed, signed and ratified with the EU. And it's not just a technical problem that has emerged now, because if the Northern Ireland Protocol collapses, well, then all of the issues that the protocol was designed to solve become huge problems all over again, years after Brexit was supposedly resolved. And that's why Ireland is so concerned and exercised about what's happening here, because we believe the only way to ensure that the protocol is implemented as planned and as envisaged in a way that's acceptable to everybody, which involves real flexibility and pragmatism, is through negotiation. And we have been very clear and blunt with the British government that to go down the road of unilaterally disapplying large elements of an international agreement will cause an awful lot more problems than it solves. So the EU cannot accept this approach. Yeah. The UK government knows that, yet they're proceeding anyway. And I think you have to ask yourself some pretty serious questions as to what is driving this. Is this being driven by what's good for Ireland and Northern Ireland, for British-Irish relations, for a peace process, to try to address the polarisation of politics in Northern Ireland that has come from Brexit? Or is it something different?
What do you mean, domestic politics?
Well, I mean, I certainly suspect it is. But that is a matter for British politicians to decide. My job is to try to protect Irish interests in all of this. And we spent years putting together a compromise where everybody's opinions were taken into account, and we agreed a way forward that effectively allowed Northern Ireland to stay as part of an extended EU single market for goods, to prevent the need for border infrastructure on the island of Ireland, and of course facilitate Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom leaving the EU. And that agreement, which Boris Johnson proposed, sold during an election campaign, got ratified with a huge majority, is now what he is deliberately disapplying through domestic legislation in a way that we think is illegal.
But is British politics also coming into the European negotiating position, in that you look across to Boris Johnson and wonder if he'll still be Prime Minister at the end of the year or next year? And so, you know, are you dragging this out, if you like, for hope of a better deal with a better Prime Minister from your point of view?
Well, I mean, the EU is not looking to drag out anything. The EU has been looking for engagement between the two negotiating teams since early February and has got nothing back from the British government since then. And I think some of that is understandable because, of course, there was an election in Northern Ireland. And so negotiations understandably stalled during that period. But the expectation was that once those elections in Northern Ireland concluded, that we would see a British government looking to re-engage in negotiations seriously and quickly. And instead of that, we've seen the British government do the opposite. They've effectively not engaged in serious discussion and instead now decided to publish legislation which breaches international law. For whatever domestic political reason, they've decided to do that. The upshot outside of the UK is that this is seen as a new low in British-Irish relations, certainly in the last 24 years since the Good Friday Agreement.
It doesn't have to be a confrontation if the EU agrees to what Boris Johnson says are small bureaucratic measures, effectively a green lane and a red lane. It's very close to what the EU had proposed itself in the past. He says it's not a big deal. Why don't you just agree to it?
Because that isn't what they're asking to do. The British government is proposing to disapply key elements of the protocol, not just in terms of a green and red lane proposal, which isn't a million miles away from what the EU proposed last October. And if the British government wants to deliver that outcome, they should be negotiating with the EU, who wants to negotiate a very similar outcome to that. But the British government, of course, isn't satisfied with that. They also want to ensure that EU VAT rules in Northern Ireland don't apply. They also don't want the ECJ, who are the arbiter of EU rules in terms of how the single market operates, to have anything to do with how those rules may operate in Northern Ireland in the future. And of course, in relation to state aid rules as well. The British government wants to be able to do what it wants in Northern Ireland, despite the fact that Northern Ireland will be part of an extended EU single market, which they know can't work. So what the British government is doing is they are asking the EU to accept things that they know the EU cannot accept. And so that is why the view across the European Union is that the British government does not want a negotiated solution, because the asks that they have can't be delivered. And instead, there is another agenda here in terms of the British government being seen to stand up to the EU by passing its own domestic legislation to disapply an agreement that the British government now wants to disown. But there are serious consequences that fall out from that for your closest neighbour here in Ireland, but also for many other European countries as well. And that is why the British government needs to rethink. And I hope that the British parliamentary system will ensure that this legislation gets the kind of scrutiny that it needs to show it up for what it is.
Simon Coveney, thank you very much.
Thank you.